Look at you, half a man.
Let them try. Drive safe.
He didn't lose his empire to a bullet. He lost it to a wheelchair. Vincent was the most feared man in this city until a severed spine turned him into a ghost, haunting his own house. His fiancée loved the crown, but she couldn't stomach a crippled king. She left him to rot in that gilded cage, ignoring him for healthy men. But she missed one detail. The quiet maid hired to clean his messes was the only one brave enough to look the devil straight in the eye, to actually treat him like a man. A bullet had shattered his T12 vertebra, ripping the entire world away from Vincent Corvino. Before that hit, his name was pure currency. Guys lowered their voices just saying it. They handed over cuts of shipping routes, construction contracts, and union dues just to keep his gaze pointed somewhere else. Now his whole universe shrank to the four walls of a sprawling master bedroom. That, and the relentless mechanical hum of his alternating pressure mattress. He couldn't feel his legs. Not some numb emptiness, just dead weight. Like 2 bags of wet cement anchored straight to his pelvis. The doctors called it paraplegia. Vincent called it a tomb. Across the room, Arya sat at her vanity applying dark crimson lipstick, her jaw tight, eyes locked entirely on her backlit reflection. She wore a silk robe slipping off one shoulder. Once that sight would have stirred him. Now she was just another cold fixture in the room. Dominic called again, Arya said, never even looking back at the bed. She smacked her lips together, evening out the color. Dominic needed the signatures for the harborfront property. Vincent stared at the ceiling. Ornate floral plaster. He knew every single crack up there. Tell Dominic to bring the papers here. I am paralyzed, not brain dead. Arya sighed a sharp, dramatic sound that grated right against his ears. She dropped the lipstick tube onto the marble vanity with a heavy clatter. She told Vince he knows Dominic doesn't want to come up here. The guys just don't know how to act around him anymore. It makes them uncomfortable. Vincent turned his head, the only part still moving with its old fluidity. He studied the woman he was marrying in 3 months. The engagement ring caught the morning light, a 5-carat diamond bought with blood and leverage. She absolutely hated looking at him. When she did, her eyes darted to his shoulder, the headboard, the IV stand, anywhere but his face. And certainly never those useless legs beneath the duvet. Then Dominic doesn't get the harbor. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. Arya stood up, tightening her robe. Turning to him, her face mixed pity with profound irritation. She had no time to play messenger between a ghost and the family. Her noon fitting was waiting. She promised to send up his lunch instead. She walked out without waiting for a reply. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Silence flooded the room, thick and suffocating. Vincent closed his eyes. The rage was still there, burning hot in his chest. With nowhere to go. A boss without an army is just a target. A king who can't stand is a joke. He gripped the bedsheet with hands that could still crush a windpipe. His upper body was stronger than ever, overcompensating for all that dead weight below. But what good was muscle if you couldn't leave the bed? 20 minutes later, the door handle turned. Not a sharp twist of quiet. Respectful click. A woman stepped inside carrying a tray with warm water, clean towels, and his morning medications. Her name was Tessa. She wasn't part of his world. She didn't wear designer clothes or smell of expensive, cloying perfume. And she didn't look at him like he was a rotting corpse. She wore a simple dark blue uniform, her brown hair tied back in a messy knot, heavy dark circles under her eyes. They spoke of double shifts and a life lived on the razor edge of a bank balance. She walked to the bedside table, setting the tray down. "Morning, Mr. Corvino," she said, her voice flat, completely practical. Vincent didn't answer. He rarely did. He just watched her. Tessa didn't seem to care about his silence, moving with a quiet efficiency that actually fascinated him. The other nurses and maids Arya hired over the past 6 months either trembled, terrified of his mob boss reputation, or they completely patronized him. Using high, soft voices like the bullet had somehow damaged his hearing and intellect. Tessa did neither of those things. She just pulled the duvet down. Vincent felt his jaw tighten. He hated this part, the sheer exposure of it. His legs were thinning, muscle atrophy setting in, despite physical therapy 3 times a week. Tessa didn't hesitate. She didn't wince. She simply took his right ankle, supporting the joint with complete professional ease. She began rotating it, pushing the dead limb through its range of motion to keep those muscles from contracting. Her hands were warm, her grip firm. She wasn't afraid of breaking him, and she certainly wasn't disgusted by him. Noting his left foot was swelling a bit, speaking more to herself than him, she promised to elevate it after the bath. Vincent studied her face. No makeup. A small scar above her left eyebrow. Quiet concentration in her eyes. "Why are you here?" Vincent asked, the words just scraping out of his throat. Tessa paused, holding his knee. She looked up. "It is Tuesday. I work Tuesdays." He clarified, "Why do you work here?" His dark eyes locked right onto hers. "In this house. With me, the others usually quit by week 2. You have been here a month." Tessa held his gaze. She didn't flinch. "You pay $35 an hour. The agency takes 10. I keep 25. I have rent, and my sister has medical bills. That is why I am here." She went back to stretching his leg. No grand declarations of loyalty. No praise. Just raw, unvarnished truth. Vincent felt a strange sensation in his chest. A tiny crack in the ice. He looked down at her hands. Strong and steady. Working over muscles he could no longer feel. Keeping the blood flowing in a body everyone else had already buried. 25 isn't enough, Vincent said quietly. Tessa reached for a warm, damp towel. "It is better than minimum wage." "Mr. Corvino, can you lean forward?" He grabbed the trapeze bar over the bed, pulling his heavy torso up. Tessa washed his back, the warm cloth soothing the tight muscles around his shoulders, for the first time in months. Vincent didn't feel like a piece of broken furniture. He felt briefly like a man again. By the 3rd month of Tessa working there, a quiet routine had locked into place. Arya was just a ghost. She slept in the guest wing, claiming his medical equipment was too loud for her to rest. His money was spent with reckless abandon, hosting lavish lunches, expanding her wardrobe, and holding court with the wives of his underbosses. She was securing her position, playing the resilient fiancé, just waiting for him to die, or fade into complete obscurity, so she could inherit the Mafia empire without the heavy inconvenience of his ruined body. Tessa was the exact opposite. She was the gravity keeping Vincent tethered to the earth. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. The sky outside the towering bedroom windows looked like bruised iron. Vincent sat in his customized wheelchair, staring out at the manicured lawns turning to thick mud. "They are having a meeting downstairs," Vincent said. He didn't turn his head. He knew Tessa was in the room, quietly sorting his laundry. "I know," Tessa replied, folding a dark shirt. "I saw the cars pull up, 6 black SUVs blocking the delivery entrance." "My capos," Vincent murmured. "Dominic, Polly, Frank. They are carving up the south side, and they didn't invite me." He gripped the chair armrests, the heavy leather creaking under his massive hands. He could perfectly picture the scene down in his mahogany dining room. Sigars, bourbon, the low murmur of men negotiating territory that actually belonged to him. Arya would be there pouring drinks, smiling at Dominic, laughing at Polly and his jokes, playing the gracious host, acting as the gatekeeper to a gate already locked tight against him. "You are the boss, aren't you?" Tessa asked. She walked over, placing a folded stack of clothes into the dresser. "I was," Vincent said, the bitterness thick on his tongue. "Now I am just the bank. They use my name to keep the streets quiet, but they don't answer to me. A wolf pack doesn't follow a crippled alpha." Tessa closed the drawer. She walked over to his chair. She offered 0 empty platitudes. No telling him he was still strong, or that things would somehow get better. She dealt in cold reality, just like he did. "Your catheter needs emptying," she said, pulling on a pair of blue latex gloves. Vincent closed his eyes as a familiar wave of humiliation washed over him. It never went away. The sheer indignity of losing control over his own body, having a woman he barely knew handle his most basic, intimate functions, with those men downstairs dividing up his empire. The stark reality of his physical dependence felt like a knife twisting right in his gut. He let his head fall back against the headrest, bracing for the shame. But Tessa was quick, clinical, yet gentle. She knelt beside his chair, unhooking the bag strapped to his calf. No disgusted faces. She didn't rush. No dawdling either. "You are angry," Tessa said quietly, emptying the fluid into a basin. "I am a lot of things," Vincent said, his voice completely tight. "You are letting them treat you like a corpse," Tessa stated. Not an accusation, just a cold observation. She wiped the valve with an alcohol pad, reattaching it to his leg, securing the Velcro straps so they wouldn't chafe. Vincent glared at her. "What do you suggest, Tessa? Should I roll down there and run them over? Challenge Dominic to a fistfight? I can't feel my legs." Tessa peeled off her gloves and tossed them straight into the biohazard bin, washed her hands, marched right back out. She crossed her arms, planting herself dead center in front of his wheelchair. "You cannot feel your legs," she agreed, "but your mouth works. Your brain functions perfectly fine. You built this crime family because you were brilliant, not because you could walk." Vincent just stared. Nobody ever spoke to him like that. Before the accident, anyone taking that tone ended up dead in a trunk somewhere. But now, hearing it from an exhausted, underpaid maid felt like the first real breath of oxygen he had caught in a year. Arya tells the family I am too weak for visitors, Vincent muttered. Arya tells the crew whatever suits Arya. Tessa fired right back. She leaned in, bringing her face dead level with his. Her hazel eyes were totally empty of fear. She treats you like a heavy burden, Mr. Corvino, simply because you let her do it. You stay locked up in this bedroom like a hostage. Eat when they command. Sleep when they say so. And why do you care? Vincent shot back, his chest heaving hard. You get paid either way. I care because I absolutely despise watching people give up, Tessa replied, her voice dropping to pure stone. My sister gave up. Quit her meds. Quit her physical therapy entirely. She let the sickness completely take over because dying was just a hell of a lot easier than fighting. And now I watch you rot in this chair, a man who supposedly ran the Chicago mob, letting a woman who cannot even look you in the eye slowly dig your grave. She did not wait for his reaction, grabbed the plastic basin, and marched straight toward the bathroom. Vincent just watched her go, his heart hammered violently against his ribs. This was no longer the lethargic thump of a dying man. It was the aggressive rhythm of a cornered animal, realizing it still had teeth. Tessa, he called out. She paused at the doorway, glancing back over her shoulder. Get me dressed, Vincent ordered. The gravel in his voice was totally gone, replaced entirely by cold steel. Get the navy Brioni suit, the custom one tailor-cut before the hit, and fetch my watch. Tessa allowed the absolute ghost of a smile. Yes, sir, the custom elevator hummed, carrying Vincent all the way down to the ground floor. The mansion got retrofitted right after his hospital discharge. Just an ugly glass tube that completely ruined the grand staircase. He had used the damn thing exactly twice. He sat perfectly rigid in the wheelchair, wearing that expensive navy Brioni suit. It fit a little loose around his thighs now, but the jacket stretched flawlessly across those broad shoulders. Tessa spent 20 minutes ensuring he looked immaculate, hair slicked back, jaw cleanly beshaved, rocking that heavy Patek Philippe watch. He looked exactly like Vincent Corvino again, except for the wheels underneath him. Tessa stood close behind his chair, resting her hands lightly on the push handles. I can push myself, Vincent said quietly as the elevator neared the bottom floor. I know, Tessa replied, but a king never pushes his own carriage. Vincent did not smile, but a profound warmth finally settled deep in his chest. Reaching back blindly, his massive hand found hers gripping the black metal. He squeezed her fingers once a silent acknowledgement. She squeezed back, grounding him instantly. The metal doors chimed and slid apart. A low hum of conversation drifted down the long hallway from the formal dining room, punctuated by clinking crystal and heavy, raucous laughter. Vincent rolled himself straight out of the car. Tessa walked exactly half a step behind him like a silent shadow. As they approached the open double doors of the dining room, that heavy laughter grew significantly louder. He stopped just outside the threshold. Inside, 10 armed men sat around his custom mahogany table. Dominic, his underboss, sat right at the head of Vincent's chair. The bastard was smoking a thick cigar, kicking his polished shoes up on the rung of a neighboring seat. Arya was leaning right over him, pouring dark amber bourbon into his glass. Her hand lingered on Dominic's shoulder, just a second too long. So I told the union rep you either take the deal, or the concrete trucks stop rolling on Tuesday, Dominic bragged, waving his expensive cigar around. The entire table erupted in chuckles. Vincent gripped the wheels. He rolled into the room. Thick Persian carpets completely silenced his entry. It hardly mattered. The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees, one by one. The Mafia crew noticed him sitting there. Laughter died right in their throats. Whiskey glasses were slowly lowered back to the mahogany. Hardened soldiers who killed without a single ounce of remorse suddenly found themselves staring at their dinner plates. Dominic completely froze, his cigar hovering halfway to his mouth. Arya gasped. She took a quick step back, nearly dropping the heavy crystal decanter. Vincent, she stammered, all the color instantly draining from her face. What are you doing down here? The doctor said you need rest. The doctor is not my boss. Arya, Vincent replied. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried effortlessly through the thick cigar smoke. He rolled forward, heading directly for the head of the table. Dominic just stared. A rapid flicker of pure panic flashed behind his eyes, before he hurriedly scrambled to his feet. The underboss nearly knocked his heavy chair over in his sudden rush. Vince, Dominic said, forcing a tight grin that never quite reached his eyes. We did not expect you. Arya said you were having a pretty bad day. I was having a quiet day. Dom, Vincent corrected him. He pulled his wheelchair right into the exact space. His underboss had just vacated. He looked around at the grim faces of his crew. Polly, Frank, Silvio. They were literally sweating. A quiet day until I heard rats scratching in the walls. The silence became absolute. Arya stepped forward, her heels clicking nervously against the polished hardwood. Vincent, please. You are embarrassing yourself. Let us get you back upstairs. Tessa, she snapped, finally noticing the maid standing quietly near the doorway. Take him back to his room right now. Tessa did not even flinch. She just kept her eyes locked entirely on Vincent. Tessa works for me. Arya, Vincent said very smoothly. Not for you. Then he reached for a glass of water on the table. His hand was usually a rock. Now it trembled slightly from the adrenaline and the immense physical strain of sitting up unsupported. As his fingers wrapped around the heavy crystal, his weak grip slipped, the glass tipped over. It fell and shattered against the mahogany, sending ice water and sharp shards cascading right across his lap. A collective breath was drawn across the incredibly tense room. This was the exact moment they had waited, for the ultimate confirmation of his physical weakness. Dominic's eyes flashed with a brief, ugly triumph. A mafia boss who could not even hold a damn glass of water. Arya let out a sound of absolute disgust. For God's sake, Vincent, look at what you did. You are making a total mess. I told you to stay upstairs. She looked right over at Dominic, rolling her eyes in a blatant appeal for sympathy. Vincent sat completely frozen. Cold water soaked into his expensive trousers. He could not feel the wetness at all, but he knew exactly how pathetic it looked. The humiliation threatened to choke him right there. He had gambled his remaining dignity and lost in front of his entire crew. He closed his eyes, ready to retreat to his tomb. And then sudden motion. Tessa was right at his side. She did not grab a towel. She did not call for the other household staff. She simply picked up a pristine white cloth napkin, completely ignored the heavy stares of the deadliest men in Chicago, and knelt beside his chair. She began to wipe the spilled water from his trousers, meticulously picking up every single tiny shard of broken glass. Leave it, Vincent growled, his bruised pride practically bleeding out onto the hardwood floor. Just get me out of here. Tessa paused. She looked right up at him, entirely ignoring the heavy audience in the room. A spilled glass of water does not drown a man. Mr. Corvino, she said, her tone perfectly clear and steady. She stood back up, placing the damp napkin and the ruined glass onto a silver serving tray. She turned back to the mahogany table. Her gaze swept right over the hardened criminals, before settling heavily on Arya. Mr. Corvino would prefer bourbon, Tessa stated, staring directly at his fiancé. Since you hold the decanter, Miss Harrington, would you pour it? Or should I? The sheer audacity of the maid struck the incredibly quiet room like a physical blow. Arya opened her mouth. Absolutely no words came out. Dominic stared at Tessa like she had just grown a second head. Vincent looked at the woman standing tall by his side, defending his dignity when his own body betrayed him. She was no mere maid. She was a soldier, his soldier. Leaning forward, Vincent rested his thick forearms on the table. All weakness vanished, instantly replaced by cold, terrifying authority. He looked dead at Dominic. Pour the drink, Arya, Vincent ordered, never once taking his eyes off his underboss. And then, pack your bags. You are moving out tonight. Arya did not leave quietly. The massive estate completely echoed with the violent sound of slamming drawers and shattering perfume bottles. Back in the formal dining room, the crime family crew had filed out incredibly fast. Made men do not run, but their exit was a hasty, synchronized retreat. Dominic was the very last man to step away, pausing at the heavy double doors. He tried to salvage his ruined coup. He forced a tight, plastic smile. Glad to see you out of bed. Boss said they were just keeping the seat warm, just keeping the engine running for him. Vincent completely ignored him. He just stared straight down at the dark amber liquid in his glass. The engine is mine. Dom, if I catch you behind the wheel again, I will personally break both your hands. Get out of my house. Dominic clenched his jaw tight. A flash of pure malice crossed his shadowed face before he finally nodded, slipping out into the heavy rain. An hour later, the heavy estate doors stood wide open. 2 guards lugged Arya's matching Louis Vuitton bags outside to an idling town car. Vincent remained at the head of the long dining table. The spilled water was gone, the shattered glass completely swept away. The only proof of his momentary weakness was a damp chill seeping through his trousers. He felt that biting cold only at the top of his thighs, right where dead nerves frayed back into living tissue. High heels cracked like gunfire across the marble foyer. Arya stormed straight back into the dining room, yanking a trench coat tight around her waist. Her face was flushed bright red, furious. Completely genuine tears streaked her flawless makeup. Honestly, it was the most real emotion he had seen from her in 6 whole months. She warned him he was making a massive mistake. She spat the words. Her voice shook with absolute rage. She demanded to know if he actually thought he could just throw her out, especially after everything she had sacrificed for him. Sacrificed. Vincent slightly turned his wheelchair to face her. You drank my wine, bled my accounts dry, and auditioned my underboss for my job, while I lay rotting upstairs. Your dignity is the only thing you sacrificed. Arya sneered, crossing her arms tight. She stared right down at his dead legs, a cruel, heavily practiced weapon. She told him he needed her. Look at you. Vincent, you are half a man. You think Dominic respects you. Do you really think any of the mob captains do? They are laughing at you. Without her playing the loyal wife to smooth things over, the family would eat him alive. Let them try. Vincent answered smoothly. You are pathetic, she hissed. Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. Looking right past him, she locked her eyes onto Tessa standing quietly by the credenza. She asked the woman if she actually thought she was special, just for wiping up his mess. You are a maid. When he finally chokes on his own spit, you will be out on the street with absolutely nothing. Tessa barely blinked, refusing to shrink under the wealthy woman's glare. Tessa grabbed a dry microfiber cloth. She started polishing the mahogany table, right where the water had spilled. She told Miss Harrington to drive safe. The roads were pretty slick out there. Arya let out a breathless scoff of utter disbelief, spun on her heel, and marched straight out the front door. The heavy oak front door slammed shut. It carried a finality that rattled the chandelier glass overhead. Silence reclaimed the room, the grand, echoing quiet of a literal tomb. And yet, for the very first time in a year, Vincent didn't feel like a corpse. He looked over at Tessa. She was still wiping the wood, methodical, totally calm. You just made a powerful enemy, Vincent noted. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet space. Arya comes from old money. Her father literally has judges in his pocket. Tessa just kept wiping. She told the Mafia boss she cleaned toilets for a living. She wasn't afraid of a woman whose biggest hardship in life was a chipped manicure. Vincent exhaled slowly. It was the closest thing to a genuine laugh he had managed since the bullet hit his spine. He reached for the glass of bourbon Arya had poured before she was banished. He picked it up. His hand was entirely steady now. The tremor of exhaustion and adrenaline had finally passed. He took a slow sip, letting the alcohol burn a clean path straight down his throat. He told her they needed to change the locks. Tessa threw the cloth over her shoulder, said she already told the guards a locksmith was arriving at 8. He studied her, the dark blue scrubs, the tired eyes, the absolute lack of pretense. You stepped out of your lane tonight. Tessa, you embarrassed my underboss. You ordered my fiancé right out of the house. Tessa finally looked up at him. She asked if he wanted her to pack her bags too. No, Vincent set his glass down hard. I want you to move my office downstairs. The transition took 3 whole days. Vincent completely refused to go back to the master bedroom. That space felt like a symbol of his surrender. Instead, he claimed the massive wood-paneled library on the ground floor. It featured floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive fireplace, and heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the Chicago skyline. Tessa coordinated all the logistics. She directed the burly security guards to dismantle his hospital bed upstairs. Then she had them rebuild the entire thing, right in the corner of the library, hiding it behind a heavy leather privacy screen. She made them haul his massive oak desk out of storage and position it right in the center of the room. Vincent just watched her work. He sat in his wheelchair with a laptop resting on his dead thighs. He was finally reconnecting with a crime family he had ignored for far too long. He fired off encrypted messages, checked his offshore bank accounts, reviewed the mob ledgers Dominic was supposedly managing. The numbers were bleeding out. Dominic had been skimming cash. He was getting pretty sloppy and assuming to never actually look at the syndicate books again. Lift on 3. Tessa's voice sliced right through his dark thoughts. Vincent set the laptop on the desk. It was noon. Time for his pressure relief and range of motion exercises. Tessa wheeled him behind the thick leather screen. She locked the brakes on his chair. This was the brutal daily reality of his life. The ugly, mechanical maintenance of a shattered body. Before, he had absolutely hated it. He used to stare at the wall, wishing he was dead, while a carousel of terrified nurses handled him. But with Tessa, things were different. It was a quiet, unspoken partnership. She unbuttoned his dress shirt. He completely refused to wear pajamas anymore. If he was going to run this crime family, he dressed the part even if he couldn't walk. Lean forward, she instructed. Vincent gripped the armrests and pushed his heavy torso forward. Tessa unclasped the thick leather belt, keeping his core stable in the chair. She reached around behind him, her hands pressed firmly against the base of his spine. She was checking the skin for the early red warning signs of bed sores. Her touch was purely clinical, but never cold. It was the touch of someone who actually gave a damn, whether he lived or rotted away. Skin looks good, she murmured, standing back up, no breakdown. And you are sitting straighter. I have a reason to, Vincent told her. She stepped in front of him to adjust his dead weight. Kneeling down, she lifted his right leg to position it perfectly on the footrest. As she leaned in, her face was just inches from his chest. He could smell her cheap vanilla soap, mixed with the faint, metallic scent of industrial cleaning supplies. It was infinitely better than Arya's suffocating Chanel perfume. I looked into your agency file, Vincent said softly, staring down at the top of her head. Tessa completely froze. She slowly lowered his leg and looked right up at him. Her eyes narrowed. She accused him of hacking her file. I am a mob boss. Tessa, I don't hack. I pay people to look. Vincent held her steady gaze. Your sister Sarah has multiple sclerosis. Tessa's jaw tightened instantly. She stood up and stepped back, wiping her hands on her scrubs to put some physical distance between them. That is absolutely none of your business. It became my business the second you stood between me and a table full of killers, Vincent replied. His voice was a calm anchor in the sudden tension. The medical bills are absolutely drowning you. The agency takes a third of your pay. You are working 60 hours a week, just to keep her in a facility that barely changes her sheets. Stop, Tessa demanded. Her voice cracked slightly, before she reinforced it with pure steel. I do not need your pity, Mr. Corvino. I work for my money, and I take care of my own. It is not pity. Vincent reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick white envelope and tossed it onto the edge of the desk. It landed with a heavy, distinct thud. That is $50,000 in cash. Clean money from a legitimate real estate holding. Tessa just stared at the envelope. She didn't move a single inch toward it. She asked if it was severance. It is a retainer, Vincent said. He leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers quietly together in his lap. You quit the agency today. You work directly for me now. Your salary is $10,000 a month. Sarah gets moved to the Oakstone Clinic in Evanston tomorrow. Best neurological care in the state. I already made the call, and they have a room waiting. Tessa's breath hitched in her throat. Oakstone. It was the absolute gold standard, a place she had driven past but never dared to call. The waitlist took years, and the cost was absolutely astronomical. She looked from the envelope straight back to Vincent, her eyes wide. The cynical armor she always wore slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the deeply exhausted, desperate woman underneath. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Because I need someone I can actually trust, Vince said simply. Dominic has the Mafia captains, and Arya owns the politicians. I have a wheelchair and a very fat bank account. I need a right hand, someone to manage this estate, handle my care, and keep their mouth entirely shut. Tessa stared right at him. You are buying my loyalty. I am securing an asset, Vincent had corrected, a faint smirk finally touching his lips. And I am paying exactly what you are actually worth. Tessa looked down at the envelope again. Slowly, she reached out and picked it up without opening it. She just held it, the sheer weight of the thing, anchoring her to the floor. When she looked back at Vincent, the vulnerability was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying resolve. Oakstone, she confirmed. Tomorrow morning. Vincent nodded once. She slipped the envelope deep into her pocket. I guess you are my only boss now, she said. What do we do first? First, Vincent replied, turning his chair toward the glow of his monitors. We cut the head off a snake. Dominic was not a stupid man, but he was deeply impatient. And impatience breeds absolute sloppiness. 4 days had passed since the dinner incident. Dominic kept his distance. No apologies. No visits. Instead, he finally made his move. Vincent sat in the dim library, staring at the flashing cursor on his secure app. A message from Leo, an old-school dock foreman, completely loyal to Vincent's father. 3 containers moving tonight, down at Pier 4. Dom completely bypassed the local union. Not a single cent kicked up to the crime family. Vincent clenched his jaw. Russian muscle. Dominic was not just skimming anymore. He was going totally rogue, pushing product through Vincent's territory, hiring foreign enforcers, and cutting the Corvino family out cold. A blatant declaration of war. Before the bullet, Vincent would have driven to Pier 4 himself. He would have put a gun to Dominic's head and dumped him in the lake. Now he had to use his mind instead. Time to remind his crew that the brain is the absolute deadliest weapon in the human body. "Tessa," Vincent called out. She stepped from the hallway, in her hands a tray with his evening pills and a heavy pour of scotch. The blue hospital scrubs were entirely gone, swapped for dark slacks and a tailored black button-down. Less of a maid now, more of an executive assistant. "Set up the secure line," Vincent ordered. "Call Dominic, and tell him to get to the estate right now." Tessa set the tray down without asking a single question. She pulled the encrypted satellite phone from Vincent's top drawer, punching in the digits entirely from memory. Vincent watched her closely. She pressed the receiver to her ear, her face a completely unreadable mask. "Dominic, it is Tessa. Mr. Corvino needs you at the estate right now." She paused, absorbing the muffled shouting on the other end of the line. Her cold eyes flicked straight back to Vincent. "He does not care if you are eating dinner. Come to the library entrance. Right now." She ended the call and set the device down. "He is pretty pissed off," she reported. "Said he will be here in 20. Good, let him be pissed." Vincent rolled his wheelchair toward the massive oak desk. He yanked open a lower drawer, pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, and slammed it onto the wood. "He thinks because I cannot walk, I cannot reach him." 25 minutes later, the heavy library doors swung wide. Dominic stepped inside. He wore a sharp gray suit, the top button left casually undone. He scanned the space, taking in the glowing monitors, the medical screens in the corner, the thick files scattered across the desk. He looked slightly on edge. The library did not feel like a sick room anymore. It felt exactly like a war room. Tessa stood behind Vincent's chair, hands clasped formally behind her back. "You called," Boss Dominic said, approaching the desk. He refused to sit. Standing tall was a very subtle assertion of physical dominance over the paralyzed Mafia boss. "I was right in the middle of a sit-down with the Southside crew," Dominic said, "keeping the peace since you have been out of commission." Vincent did not look up right away. He just slowly opened the heavy leather ledger. He turned a few pages. "Pier 4, Dom," Vincent said softly. Dominic froze halfway to the desk, his broad shoulders stiffening. "What about it? 3 containers moving tonight. Bypassing the Union. Using Russian muscle." Vincent looked up, his eyes totally flat, dark, and completely devoid of humanity. "You are running private shipments through my port, using my infrastructure, and pocketing the gross." Dominic let out a short, hollow laugh, running a hand back through his hair. "Vince, you got it all wrong. It is just a side thing, small potatoes. I was going to bring you in on the back end, once logistics were smoothed out. You have been stressed, man. I was handling it. You are stealing from me," Vincent corrected. His voice never rose above a quiet, conversational tone. That was exactly what made him so terrifying. "You are using the power vacuum you think exists to line your pockets and build an alliance with the Brada." Dominic's face hardened over. The thin pretense of respect completely vanished. He took a step closer, leaning his heavy knuckles hard on the wood. He glared down at Vincent. "Let us be real here, Vince," Dominic said, dripping with total condescension. "You are done. You sit in this chair all day having your nurse wipe you. The men respect strength. They respect a guy who can actually stand on his own 2 feet and fight for them. You think you can hold Chicago together with a laptop and a phone. The Russians are moving in. If I do not make deals, they roll right over us. I am saving this family." "You are a parasite," Vincent said smoothly. Dominic's face flushed a deep purple, and he reached inside his suit jacket. Tessa did not scream. She did not even flinch. She simply shifted her weight. Her hand dropped into her pocket, fingers wrapping tightly around the cold steel of the snub-nosed .38 Vincent had given her 2 days ago. But Vincent did not need a gun. "Pull it, Dom," Vincent whispered, staring dead into Dominic's eyes. "Pull the gun. Shoot a paralyzed man right in his own home. Let us see exactly how long you last on the street. The mob commission will have you skinned alive before sunrise for breaking the rules." Dominic hesitated. His hand hovered over his holster. His chest heaved. He was completely trapped. He could not kill the boss without sanction, and he could not back down without looking incredibly weak. Vincent reached forward, tapping a single key on his laptop. "I do not need to stand up to crush you, Dominic," Vincent said. "I just need a Wi-Fi connection." He turned the monitor around so his underboss could clearly see. On the screen was a live tactical feed of Pier 4. 3 shipping containers sat under the harsh halogen lights. Surrounding them were 20 heavily armed men in black tactical gear. But they were not Russians. They were Corvino family enforcers, led by Polly and Frank. Dominic's face instantly drained of all color. What did you do? He asked. I made a few phone calls, Vincent said, leaning back slowly in his wheelchair. I told Polly and Frank that you were selling them out to the Russians. I showed them the bank transfers you have been making to offshore accounts, the exact money you stole right from their cuts. They were very disappointed in you. Dominic just stared blankly at the screen. He watched his illegal shipment getting seized by the very men he thought he controlled. His breathing turned shallow and panicked. He looked at Vincent, finally seeing the absolute monster who built this Mafia empire in the first place. The wheelchair totally faded away. All Dominic saw was the devil. Vince, Dominic stammered, taking a slow step back. Vince, come on. We grew up together. I was just trying to keep the cash flowing. Tessa, Vincent said, never taking his eyes off his underboss. Yes, Mr. Corvino. Call the front gate. Tell the guards to let Dominic through. Vincent paused, letting the silence stretch until it threatened to snap. He is leaving Chicago tonight. If he is still inside the city limits by sunrise, call Polly. Tell him to handle it. Dominic swallowed hard. He looked from the glowing laptop, back to Vincent, and then to Tessa, standing like a stone sentinel, right behind the chair. He had been totally beaten, without a single punch being thrown. He did not say another word. He just turned and walked straight out of the library, his posture completely defeated. His little empire crumbled into dust. When the heavy door clicked shut, the suffocating tension in the room finally broke. Vincent exhaled. He rolled his neck, trying to release the agonizing pressure locked in his upper back. He looked back at the screen, watching his enforcers lock down the harbor. He was back, broken, yes. Confined to a wheelchair, sure, but he was the king again. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder, a very light touch, but firm. He looked up. Tessa stared down at him. There was zero fear in her eyes, only a profound, totally silent respect. Your scotch is getting warm, boss, she said softly. Vincent looked at her. The corners of his mouth twitched upward into a genuine, bone-tired smile. He reached up, placing his large hand right over hers, where it rested on his shoulder. Then pour me another one, he said. Winter hit Chicago like an absolute hammer. The wind screaming off Lake Michigan rattled the heavy reinforced glass of the library windows. Inside, the temperature was strictly controlled. 3 months had passed since Dominic caught his exile. The entire city Underworld had essentially been holding its breath. Everyone was just waiting for the Corvino crime family to tear itself completely apart. Instead, the syndicate tightened its iron grip. Polly and Frank, spooked by the reach of a boss who never left his house, fell in line with total religious devotion. The cash flowed freely, the streets stayed perfectly quiet, and Tessa was no longer just the help. She was the absolute gatekeeper. Hardened enforcers who spent their lives breaking kneecaps now stood nervously in the foyer, just waiting on a 30-year-old woman in tailored slacks to grant them an audience. She managed Vincent's schedule, his daily medical routines, and every secure communication. But the human body is no machine. A severed spine is never just a clean break. It is a chaotic and violently misfiring circuit board. It hit on a quiet Tuesday night. Outside, the armed security detail patrolled the perimeter through heavy snow. Inside, Vincent sat at his desk, running weekly laundering receipts from a chain of Southside dry cleaners. Tessa sat near the roaring fire on the leather sofa, buried deep in a hardcover novel. Then, without warning, Vincent's right leg shot straight out. His knee locked with a violent and sickening snap of cartilage. His foot slammed the underside of that heavy oak desk, hit hard enough to rattle the computer monitors. Vincent let out a sharp, breathless grunt. He gripped the armrests. His thick knuckles went entirely bone-white. Tessa dropped the book. She crossed the library in 3 rapid strides and slid to her knees right beside his wheelchair. She asked if it was a spasm, her voice tight, hands already reaching for his locked leg. Yeah, Vincent ground the word out through clenched teeth. Cold sweat was instantly beating across his forehead, a bad one. He could not actually feel the impact against the heavy desk, but he felt the terrifying phantom pressure building deep inside his hips. His brain fired frantic signals to dead muscles, forcing them to contract with bone-breaking strength. Then his left leg jerked wildly, kicking out and slamming the wood again. Tessa ordered him to move back. Vincent unlocked the brakes and shoved the wheelchair back to give her room. Tessa threw her weight directly over his thighs. She never treated the crime boss like fragile glass. She knew much better than that. Wrapping her arms tight around his shins, she pressed his violently jerking legs straight toward the floor, using her entire body weight to fight the severe spasticity. She commanded him to breathe, her face inches from his knees. 4 seconds out. Force your heart rate down. His chest heaved as he stared down at her. Her boots kept slipping on the Persian rug, while she fought the uncontrollable muscle spasms. The sheer indignity of it clawed right at his throat. He ruled the city, but right now he was entirely at the mercy of his own broken nerves. "Let go," Vincent gasped. His rough voice was thick with self-loathing rage. "Just let it snap." He did not care. "Shut up," Tessa snapped back. An absolute order, not a request. She pinned his quads hard. "You are not giving up in this room." She told him not on her watch. "Breathe." For 10 agonizing minutes. They waged a brutal war, right in the middle of the library. Vincent fought the suffocating panic in his chest. Tessa fought the raw mechanical force of his dead limbs. Slowly, those misfiring nerves exhausted themselves. The violent jerks faded into faint tremors, until his legs finally went heavy and slack against the footrests. Tessa stayed on her knees for a long moment, breathing hard. Her hair had fallen from its clip, hanging in damp strands around her face. Vincent slumped back against the leather headrest and closed his eyes. The adrenaline crash left him hollowed out, completely stripped to the bone. He whispered that he hated this. The sheer vulnerability in his rough voice was something nobody else had ever heard. Not his capos, not his father, and definitely not Arya. He called himself a prisoner in a dead meat sack. Tessa slowly sat back on her heels. Looking up at him, she offered zero hollow comfort, never told him he was brave. Wiping sweat from her forehead, she stood up. She walked around the desk, stopping right beside his wheelchair. Tessa softly told him to look at her. Vincent opened his eyes. They were dark, exhausted, brimming with rare and bitter defeat. Tessa reached out. She did not pat his shoulder. Instead, she pressed her warm palm flat against his cheek, a fiercely intimate gesture. Vincent caught his breath. He leaned into her touch just a fraction of an inch, anchored by the heat of her skin. "You are not a meat sack," Tessa said, her voice a low and steady rumble. "You survived a hit meant to put you in the ground. You took a city back without firing a single bullet. The Mafia soldiers outside this door do not fear your legs, Vincent. They fear your mind. They fear you." He just stared into her hazel eyes. Their usual clinical distance was entirely gone, burned away by adrenaline and the quiet intimacy of the room. Vincent asked her what she saw, his voice dropping to a rough rasp. Tessa lightly brushed her thumb along his jawline. The touch sent a sudden shockwave through his chest, a jolt that had absolutely nothing to do with damaged nerves. She answered that she saw the only man she had ever respected. She never pulled away, and he never asked her to. For a long moment, the mob boss and the maid existed in a space entirely their own. Bound by the daily trauma, they survived together. Vincent reached up, his large, calloused hand wrapped over hers against his cheek. He did not speak. His heavy grip said it all. "Stay." Tessa squeezed his hand, whispering that she was not going anywhere. But Arya Harrington was a woman who never understood a final warning. Stripped of her status as future queen of the Corvino Syndicate, she was now a total outcast in the very social circles she once ruled. Wives of the underbosses stopped returning her calls. High-end boutique owners no longer poured her champagne. She was a total pariah, tossed aside by a paralyzed man, making the humiliation absolute. And she blamed the maid for everything. Fast forward to a Thursday afternoon, when the secure phone on Vincent's mahogany desk suddenly buzzed. Tess answered. She listened for 30 seconds, her face turned entirely to stone. "Understood. Dr. Eris," she told the caller. "I will handle it." She hung up the receiver. Vincent looked up, asking if there was trouble at the clinic. Tessa stood dead still, her hands flat on the desk. Arya was at Oakstone, and she brought her father. Arthur Harrington threatened to pull his foundation funding if her sister was not discharged by sundown. Vincent's eyes darkened, a lethal. Quiet calm settled right over him. "She went after Sarah," Tessa said. Arya thought Tessa was the reason she lost her crown. Her voice held zero panic, just a cold and terrifying anger. "She assumes squeezing, my family will break me, that I will leave or betray you." Vincent reached straight into his desk drawer. He mentioned that Arthur Harrington is a federal judge who thinks his gavel makes him bulletproof. Vincent tossed a thick black flash drive onto the mahogany. "Harrington likes playing poker in private rooms above the gold exchange, and he likes to lose. He owes $3 million to a loan shark, operating out of Cicero, a shark who happens to kick a cut-up to Vincent." Tessa stared at the flash drive. "Everything is on there," Vincent continued softly. "The wire transfers, photos of Harrington meeting with bookies, audio files of him promising lenient federal sentencing in exchange for debt forgiveness. Enough for 20 years in federal prison, completely bankrupting the entire Harrington family." Vincent looked right at Tessa. He did not offer to send Polly or make a phone call. He offered her the loaded weapon. He asked if she wanted him to handle it. Tessa picked up the flash drive. The plastic felt warm in her grip. She looked at the man in the wheelchair. He was trusting her with the absolute nuclear option. No, Tessa replied. She would take the armored SUV, and Polly could drive her. 30 minutes later, the black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the glass entrance of Oakstone Clinic in Evanston. Snow was falling hard now, piling up on the icy sidewalks. Inside the sleek, modern lobby, Aria stood by reception in a white mink coat, her arms crossed tight. Beside her stood her father, Judge Arthur Harrington, an imposing guy with silver hair and a permanent scowl. The clinic administrator looked visibly panicked, completely trapped between a wealthy donor and his own medical ethics. Tessa walked straight through the automatic sliding doors. No medical scrubs today. She wore a black wool peacoat over her slacks, boots clicking sharply against the tile floor. Polly walked 2 paces behind her, an absolute mountain of a man with a broken nose and dead eyes. Aria saw her and smiled, a vicious, entirely triumphant smirk. Aria announced loudly that the maid had finally arrived, drawing the entire waiting room's attention. She asked if Tessa brought her mop to clean out the room. Tessa completely ignored her. She walked straight up to Judge Harrington. She did not look up at him. She made him look down at her. Judge Harrington, Tessa said flatly, I do not speak to the help. The judge sneered, glancing toward the clinic administrator. He ordered security to remove this woman and process the discharge papers for Sarah Rossi immediately. Tessa just reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the black flash drive, casually holding it up between her index and middle fingers. $3 million is a lot of money to lose on a pair of 8s. Arthur, she told him. The federal judge completely froze. The color instantly vanished from his face. He looked sickly, completely gray, under the harsh fluorescent lights. Aria frowned, glancing between her father and the maid, asking what she was talking about. Tessa never even looked at Aria. Her dead eyes stayed locked right on the judge. She told him, Cicero is a rough neighborhood for a man of his standing, especially when he starts trading federal sentences to clear markers with Tommy the Rat Valente. Arthur Harrington opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. His hands began to visibly shake. Tessa told him he had a choice. Her voice dropped to a soft murmur that only the judge, Aria, and Polly could hear. He could walk out of this lobby right now, retreat to his mansion, and permanently forget the name Sarah Rossi. She told him, you will never set foot in this clinic again. You will never say the name Vincent Corvino again, if I even sense you breathing in our direction. Tessa stepped half an inch closer, the absolute weight of the syndicate behind her. This drive goes straight to the FBI, the Chicago Tribune, and the Judicial Ethics Board, and while you rot in a concrete cell, the men you owe money to will come looking for your precious daughter to settle the debt. Aria finally understood, all the blood completely drained from her face. She begged her dad to have the maid arrested. Shut up, Aria, the judge hissed, his voice actually cracking. He stared at Tessa, swallowing hard. He caught the dead eyes of the mob enforcer standing right behind her. There was zero bluff in Tessa's stare. He was completely beaten. We are leaving, Arthur Harrington choked out, his fingers digging into his daughter's mink coat. Aria fought him. Dad, are you serious? You are really letting a maid talk to you like this? She is not a maid, you stupid girl. The judge snarled in terrified realization, ordering her to walk. Tessa stood center stage in the lobby. She watched the broken man practically drag his screaming daughter through the sliding glass doors and out into the freezing snow. The hospital administrator let out a very shaky breath, wiping his forehead. He deeply apologized to Miss Rossi for the disturbance. He promised her sister's room was completely secure. Just make sure she gets her physical therapy at 2 p.m., Tessa replied calmly. She pocketed the flash drive and walked right out to the waiting SUV. By the time she finally returned to the library, a fire roared in the stone hearth. The storm had escalated into a total blizzard, burying the mob estate in thick, insulating white. Vincent sat by the fire, nursing a bourbon. Not behind his desk, just a man watching the flames. Tessa peeled off her coat, shook the heavy snow from the wool, and hung it up. She crossed to the leather sofa, sinking down with a heavy, exhausted sigh. She kicked off her boots, eyes on the fire. Vincent asked about Harrington. Neutralized, Tessa replied, adding that he would never be a problem again. Neither would she. Vincent asked if she gave him the drive. No, Tessa tossed the black plastic onto the coffee table right between them. I keep my leverage. That is exactly what you taught me. Vincent finally turned his head. A slow, genuine smile changed everything about him, completely softening the harsh angles of his jaw. The cynical mob boss vanished, leaving only the man underneath. You are learning, he murmured. I had a good teacher, she replied. Then absolute silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence that choked the house when Arya lived there. This was earned. The absolute quiet of two people who fought a brutal war together and won. Vincent set his glass down. He engaged the wheelchair motors, rolling forward until his knees nearly brushed Tessa's sofa. He killed the motor and said her name quietly. She looked up, firelight dancing in her hazel eyes. When they shot me, Vincent began, his voice rough. I thought my life ended on that pavement. I thought this chair was a coffin with wheels, and Arya proved me right. She looked at me and saw a corpse. He leaned forward, gripping the heavy armrests. But you looked at the exact same broken body and saw a king. Tessa held his gaze, refusing to pull away. A crown is not carried in your legs, Vincent. It is in your chest. I am a paralyzed man, Vincent stated, laying the brutal truth completely bare. He needed her to understand the absolute permanence of it. I will never walk you down a street, he told her. Never stand up to pull out your chair. What normal men give you, I simply cannot do. I have met normal men, Tessa said softly. They run the second things get hard, they just break. I do not want a normal man. She shifted forward. Reaching out, she placed her hands directly over his on the armrests. Her touch felt like actual fire against his skin. I want the man who tore apart a city just to protect my family, she whispered. Vincent let out a terribly shaky breath, unclasping his hands. He slid his arms around her waist and pulled her in. Tessa moved seamlessly, sliding right off the edge of the sofa, to kneel on the rug between his ruined legs. She rested both hands on his broad shoulders and leaned up. Vincent buried his fingers deep in her hair, pulling her face to his. The kiss was not gentle at all. It was desperate, absolutely fierce, grounded in the ugly, beautiful reality of the crime family they had built together. It tasted like bourbon and wood smoke, a violent culmination of months of suppressed tension and shared battles. A man finding his soul again, through the one woman who simply refused to let him die. Vincent pulled her closer. His massive chest heaved against hers. His heart hammered a frantic, living rhythm against his ribs. For the first time, since that bullet tore right through his spine, he felt whole, entirely, completely whole. 1 week later, the estate dining room was packed full again. The capos sat around the massive mahogany table. The air hung heavy with cigar smoke and the low, tense hum of syndicate business. Pale winter sunlight streamed through the windows, cutting across crystal glasses. Vincent sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair, wearing a crisp charcoal suit. His posture was immaculate, his eyes dead sharp. He commanded the room with effortless authority, outlining new shipping routes, and laying down the absolute law for the Cicero expansion. And if the Russians push back? Polly asked, tapping ash into his tray. They will not, Vincent said smoothly, because they know if they touch a single one of our trucks, I will burn their port down to the waterline. The men nodded in unison. No hesitation at all, no sideways glances. The mob boss was firmly back on his throne. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. Tessa walked in. She wore a sleek, dark burgundy dress falling perfectly to her knees, her hair styled loose over her shoulders. She carried a leather portfolio. The capos stopped talking immediately. Every single man in that room sat up a little straighter. They did not look at her with the leering disrespect usually reserved for Mafia wives. They looked at her with the cautious, profound respect reserved for an equal. They knew exactly who held the keys to the crime family now. Tessa did not walk behind Vincent's wheelchair. She did not stand in the corner like some quiet shadow. Instead, she walked directly to the right side of the table, pulling out the heavy mahogany chair positioned right next to him. She sat down, placed the portfolio on the table, and crossed her legs. Vincent looked at her. The absolute ghost of a smile touched his lips. He reached under the table, his hand finding hers. Their fingers interlocked tightly in the hidden space between them. Now, Vincent said, turning his cold, commanding gaze back to his men, let us talk about the future. If you loved watching Vincent reclaim his empire, and Tessa proved that true power comes from loyalty, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a gritty, emotional mafia drama where the underdog rises to the very top. What was your absolute favorite moment, Tessa confronting the judge? Or Vincent destroying Dominic without throwing a single punch? Let us know in the comments below. Every mafia boss story is not only about power, money, revenge, or fear. Beneath the violence and darkness, there is often a painful human lesson about choices, consequences, loyalty, family, and the price of ambition. This story reminds us that no matter how powerful a person becomes, no one can escape the truth forever. Hundreds of people, and make others tremble at the sound of his name. But if his heart is empty, his victory is never complete. The mafia boss in this story represents a man who built his life on control. He believed that fear was stronger than love, that silence was safer than honesty, and that power could protect him from pain. For years, he may have won every battle in the streets, in business, and among his enemies. But the most important battle was never outside him. It was inside his own heart. That is where he truly lost himself. One of the most meaningful lessons from this story is that power without morality becomes a prison. Many people dream of becoming rich, respected, or feared. They think success means having control over others. But real success is not measured by how many people obey you. It is measured by how many lives you protect, how much peace you create, and how much good remains after you are gone. The mafia boss had money, influence, and protection, but he did not have peace. His life shows us that a person can be surrounded by luxury and still feel completely alone. Another important lesson is that loyalty is valuable, but blind loyalty can destroy lives. In the world of crime, loyalty is often treated like the highest law. People are expected to follow orders without question. Never mean giving up your conscience. A loyal person does not simply protect someone's secrets. A loyal person also has the courage to stop someone from destroying themselves. This story teaches us that loyalty without honesty is dangerous. Real loyalty should be connected to truth, respect, and moral responsibility. The story also shows the heavy cost of revenge. Revenge often feels powerful in the beginning. It gives a person the illusion that pain can be answered with pain, but revenge rarely heals anything. Instead, it creates a chain of suffering that keeps growing. One act of revenge leads to another. One betrayal leads to another. In the end, everyone loses something. The mafia boss may have believed that revenge would restore his honor, but what it truly did was steal his humanity piece by piece. This is a powerful reminder that forgiveness is not weakness. Sometimes, forgiveness is the strongest decision a person can make because it breaks the cycle of hatred. Family is another central lesson in this kind of story. Many mafia bosses claim they do everything for family. They say they commit crimes to protect the people they love. But protection without honesty can become another form of harm. A family does not only need money or security. A family needs trust, emotional safety, and love that is not poisoned by fear. If a father, husband, brother, or son becomes powerful but loses the ability to show tenderness, then his family may live in a beautiful house, but still feel trapped inside it. This story reminds us that children and loved ones often pay the price for the choices of powerful men. The mafia boss may think his decisions only affect his enemies, but every secret, every violent act, and every betrayal leaves a shadow over the innocent people around him. That is why one of the strongest educational messages is this: before making a decision, we must ask ourselves who will suffer because of it. A selfish choice may bring temporary success, but it can create long-term pain for the people we love most. Another meaningful point is the danger of pride. Pride can make a person refuse to apologize, refuse to change, and refuse to admit they are wrong. The mafia boss may have spent years believing that saying sorry would make him look weak, but in reality, the ability to apologize is a sign of strength. It takes courage to face the damage we have caused. It takes maturity to admit that we hurt someone, and it takes true character to change before it is too late. The story also teaches that redemption is possible, but it always requires sacrifice. A person cannot simply say they have changed. They must prove it through action. Redemption means accepting responsibility, protecting the innocent, telling the truth, and sometimes losing everything that was built on lies. For a mafia boss, redemption may mean walking away from power, exposing corruption, saving someone he once endangered, or choosing love over control. The path to redemption is painful because it forces a person to confront the worst parts of themselves, but it is also the only path that can lead to peace. From a human perspective, this story is powerful because it shows that even the hardest heart can still feel pain. Behind the cold eyes of a mafia boss, there may be regret, loneliness, childhood wounds, or a deep fear of being betrayed. This does not excuse his actions, but it helps us understand that broken people often break others when they never learn how to heal. The educational value here is important. Pain should not become an excuse to hurt people. Instead, pain should become a reason to grow, to seek wisdom, and to choose a better path. For viewers, the lesson is not to admire the criminal lifestyle, but to understand its emptiness. The suits, cars, mansions, and power may look attractive from the outside, but behind them there is often fear, guilt, and loss. A life built on violence can never bring true happiness. A life built on lies can never bring true freedom. And a life built on fear can never create real love. In the end, the story of a mafia boss is really a warning. It warns us that every choice has a consequence. It warns us that money cannot buy peace. It warns us that fear cannot replace respect. It warns us that revenge cannot heal a wounded heart. Most importantly, it reminds us that the greatest power a person can have is not the power to control others, but the power to control themselves. The deepest lesson is simple but meaningful. Choose character over pride. love over control, truth over silence, and forgiveness over revenge. No matter how dark a person's past may be, change is possible when they are willing to face the truth. But the longer someone waits, the higher the price becomes. A mafia boss may win the streets, defeat his enemies, and build an empire, but if he loses his soul, he has lost everything. True strength is not found in violence. True strength is found in responsibility, compassion, humility, and the courage to become better before it is too late.